All right, I think I'm going to get us going. My name is Beth Martin, and I'm a teaching professor at Washington University in St. Louis, a director of our climate change program at WashU, and also co-focal point of the Ringo constituency. I'm stepping in tonight for Tim Carter, the fearless leader of Second Nature, to kick off this third edition of our COP27 webinar series that's hosted by Second Nature, the Ringo constituency, and the University Climate Change Coalition. A quick reminder, our first two webinars were also recorded, and the recordings and the slides are available on the website. The first two webinars covered a basic overview of the UNFCCC. The second webinar touched on constituted bodies, and tonight we're going to focus on key issues to watch in 2 weeks when COP27 kicks off in Sharm el-Sheikh. Okay, next slide. Just a reminder, we are recording the webinar so that we can post it and share it, and it can be available it's openly available for those that would like to come back and take another look or another listen, also those that didn't get to watch us live. If you have any questions, please drop them in the Q&A function. We will be collecting and collating questions. We have a tremendous group of panelists tonight, and so we'll be collating those, and then our moderator, Anna, will handle those at the end. A reminder that all of our participants are on mute mode, so it's not able for you to speak. So we do need you to put any questions you have in the Q&A. Okay, next. All right, now I have the pleasure of introducing you all to Anna McGinn, the policy manager from the Environmental and Energy and Study Institute. Anna works as part of the EESI team and focuses on federal policy issues. She focuses on climate adaptation and resilience, international negotiations, as well as federal, state, and local climate commitments, equity and environmental justice, and appropriations and budget. She has dual master's degrees from the University of Maine in climate and quaternary studies, as well as global policy, and a bachelor's degree in environmental studies from Dickinson College in Pennsylvania. Been really fortunate to get to know Anna over the last several years attending COPs, and we're also very excited that she is a new member of the Ringo Steering Committee. So we're very excited to have her here serve as a host for our webinar tonight. So I'm going to put it in her capable hands. Thank you.
Great.
It's all yours, Anna.
Thanks, Beth. Thanks so much for the introduction, and many thanks to Second Nature, University Climate Change Coalition, and the Ringo Constituency Group for coordinating and hosting today's webinar. I'm really excited to be here to hear from our really excellent lineup of experts discussing key issues to watch at COP27. If we jump to the next slide, we have a super packed agenda for the next hour and a half. But before we jump in, just a couple notes to echo what Beth just shared. We will have 4 presenters this evening, followed by a moderated discussion and Q&A from the audience. So if you have any questions, as Beth mentioned, please use the Q&A chat function, and we will get to as many of them as we possibly can. Without further ado, let's jump into introductions. I'm going to introduce all our speakers up front here, and then each speaker will just pass the baton to the next as we go. So bear with me, we have very impressive people, and I just want to share a little bit about them before we jump in. So our first speaker this evening is Melissa Loh. Melissa is a research fellow at the National University of Singapore's Center for Nature-Based Climate Solutions. She previously worked at the Energy Studies Institute at the National University of Singapore, where she carried out research projects on a range of energy and climate issues of concern to Singapore and the region. She has participated in United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, so UNFCCC COPs, for over a decade, and is an active sustainability thought leader, authoring, publishing, and presenting at various forums. She serves on the steering committee of the Ringo Organization's constituency group under the UNFCCC. Our second speaker is Danielle Falzon. She's an assistant professor of sociology at Rutgers University. Her research examines power and inequality in climate-related decision-making, particularly around issues of adaptation and loss and damage. Our third speaker, jumping to the next slide, is Tracy Bach. Tracy serves as the co-focal point of the Research and Independent Non-Governmental Organizations, Ringo's constituency group, to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Secretariat. She is a law professor who has taught and published on climate change, international environmental law, human rights, healthcare, and environmental health law. Tracy is currently a visiting professor at Washington University in St. Louis and a lecturer at the Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth. She has conducted workshops and consulted in China and Myanmar with the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the UN Development Program, and the UN Environment Program. She has attended COPs and subsidiary body meetings since 2009 and led delegations to more than a dozen of these international meetings. And our final speaker this evening will be Ambassador Miguel Ruiz Cabañas Izquierdo, who has been a career ambassador at the Mexican Foreign Service since June 1998 and a career diplomat since 1979. Currently, he is a full-time professor of Mexican foreign policy and director of the Initiative on the Sustainable Development Goals at the Tecnológico de Monterrey Santa Fe campus. Additionally, he is a co-coordinator of the Mexican chapter of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, an important international network of universities and research centers that promote sustainable development. The ambassador has extensive experience as a negotiator in bilateral relations with the United States, as well as in multilateral forums such as the Organization of American States, the Food and Agriculture Organization, the World Food Program, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, and the United Nations. So with those introductions, I'm going to hand it over first to Melissa to get us started.
Thank you, Anna. Good morning, good afternoon, and good night to all of you joining this webinar. My name is Melissa Loh, and I'm a research fellow at the NUS Center for Nature-Based Climate Solutions. I'm happy to be joining you today to share about two topics. First, the Mitigation Work Program and Market Mechanisms, or Article 6, both key issues to watch at the upcoming COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. Next slide, please. The first topic I'll be sharing is the Mitigation Work Program, or the work program for urgently scaling up mitigation ambition and implementation. I know it's a mouthful. So this work program came out of COP26 last year, or more specifically, paragraph 27 of Decision 1 CMA 3. So paragraph 27 requested that the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change subsidiary bodies to recommend a draft decision on mitigation matters for consideration and adoption by CMA 4, which is the meeting upcoming in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. And the work program has to be one that is in a manner that supports the global stocktake. Another key outcome from Glasgow was paragraph 31, which decides to annually convene an international high-level ministerial roundtable on pre-2030 ambition. And finally, paragraph 32, so go to the slide before. Paragraph 32 urges countries that have not communicated their long-term low emissions, greenhouse gas emissions development strategies, as referred to in Article 4, paragraph 19 of the Paris Agreement, to do so by COP27. So I know many of you will be familiar with these long-term low emissions development strategies, but if you're not familiar with them, these are the net zero targets that many countries have already submitted. And I will just highlight here that Article 4, paragraph 19 of the Paris Agreement says that countries are encouraged to submit these. So my observation is that due to the loose language contained in Article 4, paragraph 19, it is not that surprising that not all countries have submitted these strategies as of right now. So what's been done since COP26? So if you look at the bottom half of the slide here, I'm happy to share that there have been several developments on the mitigation work program. Parties not only meet at the COP, but also during the intersessionals held usually in May or June in Bonn, Germany. And earlier this June, the subsidiary bodies had met in Bonn. So both the Subsidiary Body for Implementation, SBI, and Subsidiary Body for Scientific and Technological Advice, SubSTA, had in their report, they invited parties to submit views on the mitigation work program via the submission portal by end of September this year. And as part of the preparation for this webinar, I looked up the submissions portal and found that there were 13 submissions containing views from parties on the mitigation work program. And these include the usuals. So you have the LDC submission, or least developed country submission from Senegal. You have Indonesia, Australia, AOSIS, or the Alliance of Small Island States, LMDC, China, Japan, ILEC, United States. We've got the EU submission and ABU submission as well. There were also informal consultations that were held with heads of delegation on the matter relating to the mitigation work program in April of this year. A ministerial roundtable was also organized in May in Copenhagen, Denmark. There were ministers and high-level representatives from over 40 countries, and the meeting apparently covered a range of issues which were summarized in a co-chair's report, which you can also find online. And there will also be a pre-sessional workshop to be held just before COP starts on the 5th of November from 8:30 a.m. to 6 p.m. And if you're interested, please see the COP27 overview schedule. I'm also happy to report that some 53 countries have submitted their long-term low emissions development strategies, or long-term strategies, as of today. And if you go to the next slide, I'd like to show you some key submissions from the invitation that the SBI and Substar chairs had invited parties to submit. So you'll see here an overview of what some countries have said. As I mentioned, there are 13 countries, 13 groups that submitted MWP, or mitigation work program views. And I just like to highlight a few here. So you can see here that in the Chinese submission, they had mentioned that, they highlighted that the lack of ambition of developed countries, particularly in their 2020 target, so this is pre-2030, had set us on a path of not just a huge emissions reduction gap, but also resulted in a trust deficit. So I think if you take some of this into the negotiations, you'll find that the upcoming MWP negotiations might be quite interesting. I also noted that China had highlighted the principles of equity and common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, or more commonly known as CBDR and RC. And it also highlights that the mitigation work program needs to respect national sovereignty as a principle, design principle. It also shares that the work program should be a platform for NDC implementation, exchange, and promote parties to fulfill the NDCs comprehensively and strive to do better through mutual learning. And this comes up quite a fair bit in other country submissions as well. And the last portion that I found in page 13 of China's submission made some mention of adaptation. And now remember, this is a mitigation work program. And so this is interesting because adaptation doesn't feature very strongly in most countries, considering it is a mitigation work program. But I also noted that the LMDC, or like-minded developing countries group, also submitted a note that called for a balance of issues. And then moving on to the United States submission, you also see here that in page 2, it starts with a context, noting that several top 10 emitters and some of the largest economies in the world have not raised the level of ambition to meet the urgent call of the Paris Agreement. So this again sets the context for negotiations coming up. And the US suggests some modalities such as structure, format, leadership, substance, and the duration of the mitigation work program. And most other countries also covered this in their submission. In the annex of the US submission, they have provided a set of topics for interest. And I just wanted to highlight a few that were quite notable. So they suggested a topic on just transition for net zero, fossil fuel subsidy reform, protecting, conserving, and restoring forests, and finally, a topic on models for public-private partnership. And this differs quite strongly from some of the other submissions that have come up. AOSIS, the Alliance of Small Island States, calls for sector-focused technical discussions, and they want to draw this from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Assessment Report 6, Working Group 3 report, which talks about the highest abatement potential sectors: energy, Apollo, buildings, transport, and industry. And notably, AOSIS also highlights the role of ministerial roundtables, the MRT for short, to serve as political level accountability checkpoints for parties. As a comparison, the EU, the European Union submission, also asked that parties consider inviting line ministers so that there will be more in-depth political discussions on particular sectors. And the EU has also asked that finance ministers also come to these meetings. I thought this was really interesting and very constructive. And the last submission I wanted to highlight is from Japan. Specifically, Japan suggested that the MWP should promote certain work programs, which is including capacity building. And I thought it was a useful list of best practices that they had included in their annex, and very constructive for the upcoming negotiations. Next slide, please. So ultimately, the mitigation work program is likely to involve the adoption of a process decision on modalities and procedures rather than a substantive outcome. So they're designing the work program itself and not what specifically is going to happen. That can come a bit later. So in terms of design considerations, I covered a few parties' views already, but generally the mitigation work program should avoid any duplication of work with existing mandates under the Paris Agreement and processes. And the first thing that comes to mind is the global stocktake. The mitigation work program should also be respectful of national sovereignty of countries, and in particular in relation to the NDC cycle, which is every 5 years. And it should be flexible and capable of adapting over time to any new and emerging priorities. So to summarize the issues being discussed under this agenda item at COP27, parties will be negotiating on how the scope of the mitigation work program would reflect the objectives of urgently scaling up mitigation and ambition, and how this would interact with implementation of the Paris Agreement, the form of the work program that it should take. The parties have recommended workshops, dialogues, various sort of platforms for information sharing, but this can be quite onerous for small delegations. And they've also recommended connections with political processes, and in particular the ministerial roundtables that will happen annually. And they've also highlighted the timeline. Most countries have agreed that it should continue until 2030. Okay, so next slide and next topic. So now moving on to the next key issue is Article 6, or market mechanisms. So for the purposes of today's webinar, I will only be talking about 2 of the 3 market and non-market mechanisms, so Article 6.2 and 6.4. Next slide, please. So the Conference of Parties, serving as the meeting of the parties to the Paris Agreement, or CMA 3, at the 3rd session, adopted the decision relating to Article 6. So COP26, right, came up with the final rules, or the detailed rules of the Article 6 mechanism. And you'll see these links posted here. And I encourage all of you who are interested to go and read up a little bit more. There are 3 types of international cooperation, or market, non-market mechanisms. The first being Article 6.2, which is bilateral or multilateral approaches. Some of you may be familiar with ITMOs, or internationally transferred mitigation outcomes. And the Article 6.2 guidance provides rules to governments on how to conduct these trades between countries. Article 6.4, which is the multilateral crediting mechanisms, operates very similarly to the Kyoto Protocol's clean development mechanism. And so these will be the 2 that I will cover closely today. I will not touch on Article 6.8, which is non-market approaches. It is really important, but due to time, we'll just cover the first 2. So because of the finalization of the rules on Article 6, it now enables rapid implementation of international carbon markets to achieve NDC targets. However, there are some challenges ahead, including how to implement these new rules while ensuring that environmental integrity is not compromised, such as double counting, and seeing that the Article 6 rules gives a significant amount of authority to host parties, meaning originating countries where the carbon credits come from. A lot of capacity building is needed, particularly in regions that are not yet quite developed in these in governance and policy issues around market mechanisms. Next slide, please. So for those of you who have followed Article 6 negotiations, you'll recall that there were many key issues, some of them fairly controversial, that were negotiated for 6 years among parties, right? So the rules were all supposed to have been concluded in Katowice at COP24, but for Article 6, it was only concluded last year. I won't go through in detail, but this slide covers most of these issues, and just take some time to understand them because they'll come up again later. Next slide. So following the conclusion of the rules last year, countries continued to work on fleshing out details to help implement Article 6. In Article 6.2, these are the upcoming issues that will be discussed at COP27. Technical workshops have been organized to develop the options for tables and outlines for information required pursuant to reporting, for instance. So countries already agreed on electric format under annual information of the annex to Decision 2 CMA3. They also have to discuss further information on guidance for the registry, the international registry, and how it links up to Article 6.4. And all of these further guidance and rules will need to be discussed within the context of reducing any additional burden on parties, and they have to be simple and user-friendly, again, because a lot of the authority and power comes with host parties, and many of them do not yet have institutional arrangements that will allow this. So as simple and user-friendly as possible would be great. Next slide, please. So Article 6.4, the subsidiary body on scientific and technological advice, SAPSA, has been tasked to flesh out some of these following issues. So processes, mainly for the implementation of the transition of the activities from the Clean Development Mechanism to Article 6.4 mechanism. And also they have to decide how to use certified emissions reduction. Again, this comes under CDM towards the first or updated NDCs. We also have issues relating to reporting that have to be further discussed and fleshed out by parties. They also need to discuss the operation of the mechanism registry, which again relates to what I just mentioned in 6.2 earlier. And you'll know that there have been share of proceeds agreed under 6.4. So what are the processes for implementation of these share of proceeds, both to cover administrative expenses as well as to assist developing countries vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change? And of course, last but certainly not the least, what are the processes to deliver on overall mitigation in global emissions? If you go to the next slide, just to give you a snapshot that technical workshops were held earlier this year, I think both in September and October. And I was very glad to note that these were all open to observers, of course, in a hybrid manner. And the broadcast links and agenda were shared with observers. I certainly got an email, and they were held from 9:30 a.m. to 4 p.m. Central European Standard Time, so something like 3:30 p.m. to 10 here in Singapore. Very long and during work hours, but the links are still working, and you can definitely rewatch the proceedings if you like. And last slide. Finally, if you're keen to follow Article 6 proceedings, there have been many new developments and recent developments uploaded to the UNFCCC website. I encourage you to read the technical paper and click through the various links. Admittedly, as someone who hasn't followed Article 6 that closely until recently, these were quite difficult to find, but once you find the pages, the navigation within the pages is fairly manageable. I also did want to highlight that I was informed by colleagues that methods are going to be also discussed. So there were two methods of single-year targets agreed at COP26. You'll find these in, I believe, the annex paragraph 7 to Article 6.2 guidelines. And so these will also have to be fleshed out a bit further. But if you want more information, Siemens and Schneider gives a paper in climate policy, which I think flashes out these issues quite well. And also accounting for linked emissions trading schemes are not yet decided and will also be discussed. And finally, the Article 6.4 supervisory body will meet for the third time at COP27 or just before, from the 3rd to the 5th of November. The first and second meetings were held earlier this year. And again, observers are welcome to attend this, but deadline has passed on the 13th of October. Although in the note that was given by the supervisory body, the meeting will be live webcast and on demand from the meeting webpage. So thank you all for listening. I hope I was clear for this early in the morning here in Singapore. And now I'll hand the time over to Danielle.
Hi, everyone, and thanks, Melissa. Definitely clarified a few things for me about Article 6 and mitigation, so I appreciate that. So I'm going to start off today by talking about the global goal on adaptation. And if you could go to the next slide, please. So the global goal on adaptation was originally laid out in the Paris Agreement in Article 7.1. And so you can see on the slide there that that article states that parties establish the global goal on adaptation of enhancing adaptive capacity, strengthening resilience, and reducing vulnerability to climate change with a view to contributing to sustainable development and ensuring an adequate adaptation response in the context of the temperature goal referred to in Article 2. And so that temperature goal there is the global goal on mitigation. And so unlike the global goal on mitigation, which is very clear and sets out to limit global average temperature rise to 2 degrees Celsius with that added goal of 1.5 degrees, the Paris Agreement text about the global goal on adaptation is very broad. So what it actually means to enhance adaptive capacity, to strengthen resilience, and to reduce vulnerability in real terms, like concrete actions that can be tracked and measured, that's not included. And it's also tricky because, as the article states, it's in the context of the temperature goal. So adaptation will, of course, look different if we do meet the 1.5 degree temperature goal than if we meet instead the 2 degree goal, or if we even miss the 2 degree goal. So we already sort of set ourselves up for a kind of moving target with unclear parameters here. Next slide, please. So in 2019 at CMA2, so the conference of the parties serving as the meeting of the parties to the Paris Agreement, the second meeting, which was held in Katowice at COP24, the CMA requested that the Adaptation Committee review progress toward the global goal on adaptation in a technical paper, which would be published in 2021. And they did. And in that technical paper, they covered several important topics, including the different challenges of assessing progress on the global goal on adaptation, especially in terms of the global stocktake, which Tracy will tell us a little bit more about later. They also laid out the pros and cons of using different metrics and indicators for assessment. They identified different data collection methods, such as indicators or knowledge sharing questionnaires. And they raised several scalar considerations, such as assessing adaptation at the subnational, national, and global scales. They also identified several overarching considerations, such as the fact that the process of moving towards and ideally that the process of moving toward and monitoring a global goal on adaptation wouldn't place an additional burden on developing countries that are already limited in their resources for data collection and reporting. They also highlighted the need for flexibility as things change over time, and the need to create a holistic picture of adaptation progress that includes both qualitative and quantitative measurements that are both descriptive and evaluative in nature. So at COP26 in Glasgow, the CMA welcomed this report from the Adaptation Committee. They asked the two subsidiary bodies under the COP, so the SBI, Subsidiary Body for Implementation, and the SBSTA, to carry out a 2-year work program on the global goal on adaptation to sort out these issues that they brought up in the paper. Next slide, please. So this was called the Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh Work Program, or GLAS. The UNFCCC loves acronyms and abbreviations. So there were 4 workshops scheduled this year to start the work program, which began in June. They're open to all stakeholders, so you have representatives from country delegations and national governments, and also representatives of like international NGOs, citizens advocacy groups, and others. So the first workshop focused on enhancing understanding of the global goal on adaptation and reviewing progress. The second workshop then focused on enhancing adaptation, action, and support. The third workshop that just happened last week focused on methodologies, indicators, data and metrics, monitoring and evaluation. And then the fourth workshop, which will also take place in a pre-COP event on November 5th, will focus on communicating and reporting on adaptation priorities. And so these workshops have been structured by these overarching themes, and they have within them expert presentations on those themes and then breakout groups to focus on some key subtopics. So for example, in the latest workshop on data and metrics, there were expert presentations by the UN Disaster Risk Reduction Group on the Sendai Frameworks indicators. There was a presentation from the World Meteorological Organization on the Sustainable Development Goals as another set of potentially model indicators. There were presentations from the IPCC and from the LEG, which is the Least Developed Countries Expert Group, and there were various others. So these were presentations that were specifically requested through previous workshops. So participants, for example, had asked for more information on how other sets of global indicators had been developed. And then the way that they requested is these parties and other stakeholders can submit considerations and topics in advance of the workshops through an online portal, which the facilitators then use to inform a concept note that's put out beforehand. And now, for example, unfortunately, I was not able to attend this last workshop due to the time difference. But the good thing is that since they are open events, they're all recorded and the recordings can be found online. So I'm going to add the link to the GGA page where you can access all of those to the chat in the chat, along with some other links later on. So often in the negotiations, as I'll talk about also with regard to loss and damage in a moment, there's a divide between developed and developing countries' views of how to proceed on an issue. And so what I was hearing, especially in the first workshop, was that developing countries are adamant that adaptation as it's currently happening is woefully inadequate. And that's something that's supported by the most recent IPCC Working Group 2 report, which came out last, I think, February. And they want to make sure that there's sufficient finance and resources channeled to their countries so that they can effectively adapt and monitor that adaptation in accordance with the GGA. Meanwhile, developed countries were mostly highlighting the work that they were already doing and the tools that they have in place to assess adaptation in their own countries. So there seems to be a disconnect there, and we'll see how detrimental that disconnect is in future conversations as the work program develops. Oh, next slide, please. Now, there's several benefits to creating a global goal on adaptation. So, for example, like I said, it addresses these concerns raised by the IPCC Working Group 2, that adaptation is currently inadequate or maladaptation is happening. It also would make parties accountable to the adaptation promises they make. It would aggregate information about adaptation action and thereby identify or help us collect data to identify deficits in adaptation work. And it also would then help feed information on adaptation into the global stocktake. And so as much as a lot of this discourse and goal setting is very ideal and the extent to which it makes a difference on the ground is not certain yet, I think that the exercise of setting all of this up and thinking everything through is worthwhile because then we have something to compare the reality to. And I also included in the lower half of the slide there, the COP agenda item on the GGA. So it's item 6C. And these are the negotiating meetings, which are between parties only, that are taking place as these workshops move along. And they'll be negotiating on how the workshops will proceed and what to do with the learnings from the workshops to institutionalize them later on into an official UNFCCC text that will outline the GGA in the future. And I'm going to wrap up the GGA now just because I want to spend more time on loss and damage. So if you go to the next slide, please, I'll jump into that. So loss and damage will be one of the biggest issues at the COP this year. I think it's one of the issues that has the potential to send the negotiations into overtime beyond the 18th, as it did last year in Glasgow. And I'll get into it more in a moment, but finance for loss and damage specifically will be the main point of contention at this COP. And if it's not resolved at this COP, it's unlikely to go away anytime soon. So we're going to keep hearing about it. Next slide, please. Okay, so loss and damage is a relatively new issue under the UNFCCC. It is to some considered the third pillar of climate change alongside mitigation and adaptation. So first you mitigate the causes of climate change, then you have to adapt to the changes that climate change brings. And then we know now there are limitations to adaptation. Of course, we're not really mitigating very much. And so many things will be lost and damaged. So we must consider how to address that. And as you can see in this little graphic here, loss and damage can occur from both extreme or rapid, or extreme or otherwise known as rapid onset events, such as floods, heat waves, or cyclones, and from slow onset events, such as ocean acidification, sea level rise, and desertification. And then at the bottom there, you can see that there's both economic losses, such as loss of property or income, from agriculture or tourism. And then there's non-economic losses, which are also known as NELD, the non-economic losses and damages, or non-economic loss and damage. And that includes loss of life, loss of culture and knowledge, and loss of biodiversity, among other things. And so these complexities leave a lot to be considered in terms of what types of solutions are effective and appropriate. Next slide, please. So this is a timeline from GIZ. So I'm just going to give with it a bit of a rapid fire history of loss and damage. If anyone is more interested in this history, I will also post links to some reports with more information on that. And so it's not included in this timeline, but the idea of loss and damage was actually first raised in 1991 in the INC meetings that preceded the formation of the UNFCCC. And so Vanuatu, on behalf of the island nations group AOSIS, presented a proposal for an insurance mechanism to address the impacts that would be experienced in vulnerable countries. And now this was not ultimately included in the convention that was agreed in 1992, but AOSIS didn't give up and continued putting forward proposals until the phrase loss and damage was finally included in 2007 in the Bali Action Plan text. And parties agreed to a work program there that would begin in COP16 in Cancun. After that, something called the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage, or the WIM, was established at COP19 in 2013 after a lot of contentious conversations between developed and developing countries. And I'll say more about the WIM in a minute, but just to continue this timeline quickly to get through the rest of the events. Next came the Paris Agreement in 2015, and so loss and damage was incorporated as a standalone article, Article 8. After Paris, however, the negotiations on loss and damage really continued to take place primarily under the WIM and not under the Paris Agreement. And during this time, the WIM also established the Task Force on Displacement and conducted 2 reviews of their work. Then at COP25 in Madrid, the Santiago Network on Loss and Damage was established to support the implementation of the WIM and Article 8 of the Paris Agreement. And then at COP26, loss and damage finance specifically became an issue of central concern. So I'm going to give you a bit more information on all of these now, but that's the overarching timeline. Next slide, please. So like I said, the first institutional action on loss and damage under the UNFCCC was the WIM, the Warsaw International Mechanism. And it's mandated to enhance knowledge and understanding of the issue and its diverse components, to strengthen dialogue, coordination, coherence, and synergies among relevant stakeholders, and to enhance action and support, including finance, technology, and capacity building to address loss and damage. And it's overseen by an executive committee, the WIM ExCom, which is made up of representatives from both developed and developing countries. Next slide, please. So the WIM has 5 strategic work streams, and they're on slow onset events, non-economic losses, CRM approaches, which is comprehensive risk management, human mobility, and action and support. And then on the right there, that's a little timeline of the Task Force on Displacement that I mentioned earlier, and that they began their work in 2017. Now, there's been various consultations and reports that have been generated in these work streams and from the Task Force on Displacement. But the issue is that the WIM doesn't really have any teeth with regard to informing action or even technical progress in the COP. So it's been also consistently underfunded. So the scope of what it's able to do is very limited. And so it's good that the WIM is there, but its impact on the negotiations is still pretty marginal. Next slide, please. So after developing countries were successful in getting that WIM into place, they pushed for loss and damage to be incorporated into the Paris Agreement in 2015. And it was, like I said, included as part of Article 8, which you can see here. And I don't have time to go into it, but this article was very contentious and almost didn't happen. And so the article specifically recognizes the importance of averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage. And this language has become extremely significant, while developed countries have become insistent on using this whole phrase in recent discussions on loss and damage finance in particular. Developing countries have argued that averting and minimizing loss and damage are really mitigation and adaptation, respectively. So instead, they say we need to focus on that third component, addressing loss and damage. Also important here is that part of the compromise through which Article 8 came about was that there would be a corresponding paragraph, which is paragraph 51, in the Paris Agreement decision text, and that states that the article does not provide the grounds for liability and compensation for climate change impacts. And this was specifically something coming from John Kerry in the US at the time, since we, the US, have been avoiding loss and language around liability and compensation since the convention. And loss and damage is the issue that kind of gets closest to crossing that line into liability and compensation. And relatedly, Article 8 on loss and damage doesn't have any ties to Article 9 in the Paris Agreement, which is on climate finance. And so thus far, the discussions on climate finance under the Paris Agreement have not had to consider finance for loss and damage at all. And all of this has provided the basis for the contentions around loss and damage finance that have been building in advance of COP27, which I will return to shortly. Next slide, please. So before I get to that though, and pardon the excessive text on the screen, I know it's small, I was going to highlight some things, but forgot. So before I get into all of the finance stuff, I want to talk a little bit about the Santiago Network for Loss and Damage, which was established by parties in 2019 at COP25. So it's meant to support the implementation of the WIM and Article 8, and it's more or less a research initiative that aims to collect information on loss and damage from a variety of sources and on various topics. And it also aims to identify gaps in research and areas in need of technical assistance. So kind of to do a lot of the things that the WIM ideally would do, but isn't quite doing, and to also bring in Paris Agreement Article 8 in that. So the idea is to ultimately launch a portal through which all of this knowledge sharing and collaboration can take place, and that's still in the works. And the latest conversations I was in on the Santiago Network were around its governance structures and trying to figure out how the whole thing would be set up. And so that was proving quite difficult to figure out. And so there's still a lot to do in setting up this network, and that will also continue in Sharm el-Sheikh in a few weeks. So next slide, please. Just gonna check my time. Bringing these pieces together at COP26 in Glasgow last year, the Glasgow Pact contained quite a bit of language on loss and damage. So you can see in paragraph 66 there that the parties welcomed the further operationalization of the Santiago Network. And then more surprisingly, in paragraph 67, they decided to provide funds to the network. And that's surprising again, because funds for loss and damage have been hard to come by in the past. And at Glasgow, actually, developing countries were pushing for a loss and damage finance facility to be set up, but that was ultimately rejected. Instead, you can see in paragraph 73 there that parties agreed to establish something called the Glasgow Dialogue, which would discuss arrangements for the funding of activities to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage that began this year and will continue until June 2024. Next slide, please. Okay, so the Glasgow Dialogue, like I said, began this year in June and aimed to bring together diverse stakeholders to discuss loss and damage finance. So like the GLASS workshops, both party and non-party stakeholders are welcome to participate in these dialogues. And the first dialogue in June focused on the implementation of approaches, again, for averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage associated with climate change impacts. And honestly, it was a bit of a mess as developing countries emphasized the losses and damages that they're already facing. They noted how the agenda for the dialogue had been prepared undemocratically and argued that the dialogue had no direction as there was no report or anything else mandated to come out of it. And they insisted that the dialogue should instead be working to produce a new financial mechanism for loss and damage under the UNFCCC, which should be established at COP27. And developed country parties instead tended to bring up existing funding streams, such as humanitarian aid and disaster risk reduction, that could be improved to handle loss and damage. And they also mentioned things like insurance mechanisms and a new initiative called the Global Shield that they see as parts of the solution. And I could say more about the shortcomings of insurance and existing forms of finance later on if anyone's interested. And one more, next slide, please, last one. So somewhat shockingly to me at least, loss and damage finance has actually now been put on the agenda for COP27. So you can see there that it's under matters relating to finance and it's item 8F. And this is the first time that there will be official negotiations that focus specifically on loss and damage finance. So we'll see what happens in a few weeks. And this is going to be a major issue at the COP and one that I will definitely be following. I definitely encourage others to follow it. And that's all for me for now. I look forward to your questions on all of this later. And I will now pass it off to Tracy Bach, who will tell us more about the global stocktake.
Thanks, Danielle. Good evening from me, and good morning and good afternoon to everyone. I have the privilege today to talk about the global stocktake. And because this is a new activity authorized under the Paris Agreement, I first want to take a moment to describe what it is, or to answer that question, give you a brief summary of what happened pre-COP27 on the global stocktake, and then talk more about what is intended to happen in COP27. Next slide, please. So apologies a little bit for the blurry text, although that could be a symbolic representation on this slide. But what I wanted to do was ground our discussion of what is the global stocktake in the language that the parties used in the Paris Agreement. So you can all go to Article 14 of the Paris Agreement, and you'll see there the Conference of the Parties serving as the meeting of the parties to this agreement. In other words, the CMA. They have a requirement. Notice the shall. So one, they shall periodically take stock of what? Of the implementation of the Paris Agreement. And why? To assess the collective progress towards achieving the purpose of the agreement and its long-term goals. It goes on a little bit more, but that's really the core idea, that the global stocktake, one, happens periodically. Two, it's required. It's not an option. Three, it's done, it's a stocktake of implementation in that period. And then four, the focus is to assess collective progress towards the goals laid out, or aims laid out in Article 2 of the Paris Agreement. So the other shall function, if you look at the red circled language, is the CMA must also undertake it in a certain timeline. So the first one is to take place next year at COP28 in 2023, and then every 5 years thereafter. And why is that? Because as the Article 14, paragraph 3 lets us know, is that the outcome of the global stocktake is intended to inform parties as they update their nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, which also takes place every 5 years. All right, so I think that's the core idea of the global stocktake. So let's go to the next slide and look at it visually. So here it is laid out over time. This is, I think, a really helpful infographic that the World Resources Institution, WRI, put together a few years ago. So let's just start in 2020, when we know there was a pandemic, and so some adjustments were made, right? So we have NDCs in place by that point, whether they were intended nationally determined contributions or INDCs that were laid out before Paris, and then became nationally determined contributions at the point of ratification by countries, or if they had been updated since then, which some have been. But the bottom line is 2021, because of the pandemic, we start with this NDC mechanism. And then notice 3 years later, that's the theory of it. In reality, it's really 2 years later because of the pandemic, the first global stocktake takes place. So in 2023. And then what you see is the next updating of the year 2025, when NDCs, when parties are required to increase the ambition of their NDCs and update them. So what you see then, right, is this leapfrogging with the arrows, that parties file their NDCs, then they collectively take stock of what they achieved under those NDCs, then they revise their NDCs, and then there'll be a second global stocktake and a third all the way to 2050, when the Paris Agreement envisions achieving carbon neutrality and climate resilience. Next slide. So another picture of this, one that's provided by Carbon Brief here, is this idea of a ratchet. And so I think here you can see it in a visual, but in a slightly different way, right? So you have the lowest level of the ratchet, which the climate plans or the NDCs are submitted, right? You have the target date, and you have the stocktake, and then you ratchet up to the next NDC, and you keep going. So just another way of thinking about it. Next slide. So this is a classic. I think Danielle mentioned our love of acronyms within the UNFCCC. We also have a love of complicated graphics. So this is one of them. But what I'd like you to focus on is along the top dark bar is what you see is what is the first global stocktake, right? And it's the timeline for it and the planning for it. So it stretches over time. So the first global stocktake was launched at COP26. So that would be in last year, right? 2021. And so there's a process that has been taking place first in the summer at the intersessional meeting that we call SB 56, where the first technical dialogues took place. And now again, as we get together at COP27, we'll have the second technical dialogues with the idea of culminating with a third round of technical dialogues at SB 58 next year, which then will produce a synthesis report for COP28, which is the point at which the global stocktake will have been, the first one will have been completed and give the parties direction on how to improve the ambition of their individual NDCs. A couple of things to keep in mind. So the way these technical dialogues have been organized, just to help you with the acronyms a little bit. So why, first of all, why are we having these technical dialogues? Well, a part of that is because there's a lot of information, a lot of inputs, right? So think of IPCC reports, think of BRs, biennial reports, and biennial update reports, BURs, as the BTRs, the biennial transparency reports, come online under the Paris Agreement. All of these are rich with data that the parties, through these very structured dialogues, bring together, discuss, figure out where they need more data to do a robust assessment of, again, comprehensive achievement of Article 2.1 A, B, and C goals. The second piece to keep in mind is that there are really three areas, going back to that language out of Article 14, where that the technical assessment of progress for the global stocktake, that there are three areas or thematic areas where there's focus. So one is, of course, mitigation, that falls paradigmatically under the NDCs. The second is adaptation, and Danielle has set us up well to think through how that might be assessed and measured. And then the third is called means of implementation, which really breaks down to finance as one of the major components and other means of implementation of the agreement, like capacity building and technology development and transfer. Let's go to the next slide, please. So what I wanted to do is give you the overall overview schedule for COP27. Just came out, I think it was last week or a few days ago. It's a little bit of a blur to me. And so I wanted to give you a sense of how it's being laid out. That is the technical dialogue, which is called 1.2, technical dialogue 1.2 under the global stocktake. So one, you can see on November 7th, in the middle of this table, you'll see that there's the opening plenary of the second meeting of the technical dialogue. Again, so that's 1.2, TD 1.2 under the global stocktake. So the modalities for the stocktake are an opening plenary and a closing plenary, a lot like COP. But then it breaks down. If you go to the next slide, you'll see that the way that the parties are presenting information and sharing it is a little different. One is something that are called world cafes. I'm trying to see if that's here. I don't see them here. I didn't put everything here. So a world cafe is a more, a less structured dialogue, and usually structured around questions, moving from table to table, and allows people to kind of get outside, get outside their normal constraints as parties and as observers. So what we see here on the schedule is that after the opening plenary and the World Cafes, there will be these roundtables focused on mitigation, Roundtable 1, adaptation, Roundtable 2, and then means of implementation, Roundtable 3. I'll stop here, but I will urge you to take a look at the scenario note that the co-chairs of this process just recently posted. If you simply Google GST UNFCCC, you will end up on the web page or that part of the UNFCCC website, which really lays this out well. And I think the key thing is you'll see, one, that the co-chairs have learned from what was both strong or that worked well in the 1.1 technical dialogues to now to do some improvements for 1.2. And that two, there's really going to be a lot of opportunity for participation. So I'm happy to answer questions when we get to that point. And now what I'd like to do is hand off to Ambassador Ruiz Cabañas for his remarks. Thanks.
Thank you, Tracy, for giving me the floor. I'm very happy to participate in this webinar with wonderful presentations made by Melissa Lowe and Danielle Paulson and you, Tracy, with details and exactly how the negotiations are coming and what we can expect as a result of the COP27. So allow me to make to share with you a few slides on how I see things. I will not go into the details of the negotiation, which I think you have covered perfectly. Nothing really to add, but let me refer rather to the political context, international political arena context, where the COP27 will take place. So in my view, this is a very difficult and international scenario. The previous one to the celebration of COP27. First of all, just let me recall, today we commemorate the 77th anniversary of the establishment of the United Nations. You probably recall that on October 24, 1945, the UN Charter entered into force, representing at the time the greatest hope for a new era of international peace, respect for human rights, and international cooperation for economic and social progress. Obviously, many things have occurred since then. Many wars and violent conflicts have taken place, taking the toll of millions of lost human lives and tremendous sufferings. The end of the Cold War, globalization, the emergence of new international powers, and an unprecedented age of science and technological progress have also taken place. However, today, we are witnessing one of the most difficult and perilous times in recent history. We are witnessing the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the non-so-subtle threat that nuclear weapons could be used against that country. Not only that, but according to the UN Secretary General, today there are more than 50 violent conflicts taking place in the world. 2 billion, I repeat, 2 billion human beings live in a country affected by a violent conflict. According to Mr. Guterres, this is an unprecedented number of conflicts affecting this large group of human beings. 1 of 4 human beings living today is being affected by a violent conflict. So this is a very difficult time. And I would say that the world today is going through 4 crises, a concatenation of 4 crises. 1, I know that many countries, COVID-19 is considered a history, but I would say it's still affecting many countries. And there is a real possibility that new variants may arise and spread. The World Health Organization just warned us last week that this is a real possibility. So we cannot consider COVID-19 pandemics as something in the past. It is still with us, and it may get stronger and much more threatening in the coming weeks and months. Second, the economic recovery of last and this year has not been generalized, and there is an economic recession looming for next year, 2023. 3, there are resurgent geopolitical tensions in several parts of the world, with the United Nations Security Council permanent members directly involved. That means especially China, Russia, and the United States, which are taking increasingly confrontational positions, as we have all seen. And four, and last, and I would say the more existential threat to humankind today, there is a very real climate emergency with global warming producing floods, severe droughts, heat waves, and ice disappearing in the north and southern poles. Well, we have to take into account this context, this international scenario where COP27 will take place. Not the most desirable political environment to display, or to expect that parties will display goodwill, international cooperation spirit, and good faith negotiations. However, the world, and this is very important, I will really stress it again, the world has no alternative to really protect the environment, fight climate change, and help those countries in need. And let me say a few words why, and what I consider the most important things to be resolved by COP27. In my view, three main challenges are there for COP27, and maybe we can resume those three main challenges to one word: implementation. This is what our Egyptian friends, the hosts of the conference, have been calling all parties of the conference to get ready to go to implementation. They say, and I agree with them, that this is to put in question things that were previously approved, but now this is the time of no more words and more implementation. Let me tell you why. From Paris to Glasgow, we have a period of 6 years that many decisions were taken to develop specific rules, the so-called rule book, to implement the Paris Agreement. At Glasgow, decisions were taken to proceed with all important articles related to the Paris Agreement. Thus, no more discussion on how to cooperate is needed. What we need is implementation. In my view, three main challenges are the following. One, first of all, the challenge of trust and credibility. The COP process has taken too long to deliver real solutions to global warming and to support developing countries which demand it. Developed countries have not delivered on their promise to mobilize 100 billion a year to developing countries for the mitigation and adaptation needs and plans. At COP27, they must fulfill that commitment. Before the COP process enters into discussion to set a new target of mobilization of resources, it is really important that the developed countries comply with that commitment that they made long time ago, I would say, at a Cancun conference in 2010. So now is the time to deliver. They failed to deliver last year at Glasgow. I really hope, just to insert trust and credibility in the process, that the developed countries must comply with that commitment and that compromise that they made in various several COP conferences. This is, in my view, the most important condition for COP27 to be considered a successful conference. Second, the challenge of relevance. To ensure that the COP process remains useful, credible, the conference has to take decisions in three main areas. One, obviously, decisions that help the world to curb global emissions of greenhouse effect gases. IPCC has stated that the world must curb global emissions by half by the year 2030. Otherwise, there may be an irreversible damage to the global climate. Two, increase global funding for national adaptation plans. Last year at Glasgow, there was a decision to double international funding for national adaptation plans. So it is very, very important for many developing countries, especially those who are the less responsible for global warming, and at the same time, they are suffering the worst of its consequences. Huge floods, tremendous heat waves, and longer and deeper droughts. So increase global funding for national adaptation plans. There is a limit, though, for adaptation plans. Impossible to adapt to some hurricanes or to an extremely long and prolonged severe drought. Decisions are necessary again to provide funding and technical assistance to those countries affected by losses and damages. Look at the situation in Pakistan with losses of more than 40 billion US dollars. It is important to support these countries to allow them to recover, as an example, after a 5-degree hurricane or a devastating drought. The third challenge, in my view, is the challenge of coordination and again, of implementation. It is important that decisions taken by COP27 are timely implemented. No more wars, no more planning, no more frameworks for commemoration. Implementation. International institutions in charge of delivering funds to developing countries in a timely manner. There is an urgent need to speed up delivery of financial and technical assistance packages. These are the three main challenges that I see for the COP27 to be considered a successful conference. Some of you may say, well, Miguel Ruiz Cabañas is very, very pessimistic, and he's painting a panorama where it's going to be very difficult to take the adequate and necessary decisions for the process to make progress and really deliver solutions. Well, let me balance my previous comments with this. There is no alternative for the international community to achieve success in defeating global warming and biodiversity destruction. I think really that there is no alternative, because failure to make progress, to deliver real concrete solutions to global warming really implies the risk of the destruction of human life at planet Earth, our only house, our common house, at least as we know it. So in the last term, I would say humankind must remain united to defeat this common global existential challenge, because there is no alternative. If we fail to do it, we will not see life on planet Earth, at least as we know it. But we must be persistent, because there are many forces, many trends, including inertia, that tend to deviate us from our common global purpose. So it is important to be persistent, and at the same time, take into account that the COP conferences are a process, not an isolated event. Sometimes it has been frustrating and discouraging to see that important decisions are not taken in one COP, to see that those decisions were adopted at the following COP. And there is a reason why, because many of us, many people within governments and many people outside governments have remained persistent. They have not lost faith, and they are all the time, or most of the time, thinking in concrete solutions. Those solutions or those proposals or those pieces of negotiation that may represent the solution for a complex negotiation. So let's remain, and we have to be persistent all the time. let's put all the pressure on national governments and as well as international organizations. But more important, in my view, and this is something I learned after I left the government, and I have been working at national private university, the Tec de Monterrey. And I have learned in the last 3 or 4 years that there is not only a growing international coalition that demands climate action. This international coalition, although informal, is carrying out climate action. Subnational governments, international and national corporations, universities and research centers, and thousands, literally thousands of civil society organizations promoting and implementing solutions to global and local warming. So I believe that with strong civil society pressure, many things can happen, and I believe many will be done. To sum up, let's keep the pressure for all developed countries that they fulfill their promise on financing. Let's keep the pressure not only on developed countries, but including several developing countries, such as my own, Mexico, to do more on mitigation. But at the same time, let's focus on adaptation. Mexico is a very vulnerable country to climate change, to global warming, one of the most vulnerable countries. So I believe that we have to comply with our commitments. We have to carry out this agenda. We have to convince people, but we, at the same time, we expect that others, especially developed countries, will comply with our obligations and commitments. Thank you very much for giving me the floor. And I pass the floor to Ms. McQueen, Anna McQueen. I'm sorry if I mispronounce it, Anna.
No problem. Thank you, Ambassador.
Well, thank you for giving me the floor, to Tracy and to all of you. It has been a pleasure. My view is that if we focus, the conference focuses in these 3 areas, the conference will be considered a success. Thank you, Anna. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ambassador, for your reflections and setting us in the broader context and naming some of the needed outcomes for COP27 from your perspective. We really appreciate it. And thank you to all of our panelists for these super helpful presentations outlining what we expect to see at COP27. A reminder to folks that we are going to start running through audience questions in just a couple of moments. So feel free to add those questions in the Q&A chat function. Our panelists have also already started answering some of those questions in writing, so check those out if you were curious about any of the questions that had been posted so far. I will invite all of our panelists to have your cameras back on now, and we will jump into our first discussion question, which is kind of hearing about the intersection of the topics you all just talked about with kind of your roles and Ringo's role at COP. So we'll start with Melissa and then run through from the order you presented. I'm curious if you could reflect on the question. So each of you represents a research and independent non-governmental organization, or a Ringo organization. And so I'm wondering, what is the role that you see Ringo's playing, or you yourself playing, in contributing to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change negotiations at COP27? And in particular, if you could frame your answer in light of the key issues you discussed during your presentations, or key issues discussed by your fellow panelists during the presentation. So Melissa, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Anna. That's a great question. I think for me, here in Singapore, and being one of the very few people tracking the broad suite of issues across the negotiations, it's really challenging. Last year there was huge interest in the COP, COP26, after a delay of a year, and especially on Article 6. And so I fully agree that there's a lot of interlinkages between the topics. In particular, I can think of one that I think more countries and observers should pay attention to, which is the ambition cycle. I think Tracy talked about the ambition cycle with the enhanced transparency framework and the Article 6 mechanism. Essentially, if parties want to participate in Article 6, they have to put a lot of attention on reporting and the enhanced transparency framework. Because if they do not, they might, will be conferred to the Paris Agreement Implementation and Compliance Committee, the PIC, and they will start a consideration of issues. And so if you do not submit, for instance, an NDC or maintain a successive NDC, if you don't submit your biannual transparency report starting 2024, and you don't report on your Article 6 transfers, you could be referred to the committee. So there's a lot of interlinkages, and I probably left out a few as well. But what I will say is we need a lot of capacity building across the region of Southeast Asia, where I'm from. Again, primarily because the host countries or the originating countries where carbon credits are going to come from need a lot of support. At the moment, many countries just don't know how to report. If the biennial update reports are any indication of their institutional capacity, it's not doing very well. The track record isn't very great. So we only have 2 more years to go before the first BTRs are due. So I just wanted to highlight that capacity building, and I think increased representation from the so-called Global South, or in particular this region of Southeast Asia, is really going to be important. And I hope to see more Southeast Asian scholars and representatives coming forward to share their views and just to engage in peer-to-peer learning. Thanks.
Danielle, we'll jump to you next.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So I think related to what Melissa was just saying, I think there's an enormous need for researchers to be supporting those constituencies and countries that don't have necessarily the resources to either engage with research that's coming out, either because it's behind a paywall or is just inaccessible to them, or being able to just track and follow things and have the resources and time to devote that time and energy to following all of these different tracks. So there's a lot that especially me as someone in a university in the global north can do, in the US can do, to try and support other countries, to build research connections between countries, between universities in global north and south, to provide resources and to provide research, even if possible, to kind of move these issues forward that we see getting particularly sticky, such as loss and damage, and also adaptation and the other issues we've discussed today. So I also want to remind everyone, part of what I presented on with these workshops and the dialogues that are happening for the GGA and loss and damage, and those can be contributions to those. And when they call for different I'm blanking on the word right now, but then they call for contributions in advance of those dialogues and workshops. That can come from anyone. Any stakeholders can contribute those. That can come from a group of folks or from an individual. So I definitely encourage folks to join up and create those submissions, is the word I couldn't get before, to submit prior to when there is a call for contributions for a concept note or for a workshop. And yeah, I think that's it. So and just to stay engaged on the issues and to try to do what you can to connect with folks maybe in places with your research. Oh, I was going to say on loss and damage specifically, something that countries in the global south have been calling for is research support and having data and trying to make cases for establishing a new loss and damage finance facility, for example, or laying out the shortcomings of existing funding streams. So there's a lot of opportunities for researchers to get involved on those issues and to provide what we do best, the research, to fill those gaps. So that's all places where Ringos and other researchers and climate engaged folks can participate.
So Anna, I can just say ditto for Melissa and Danielle. They really covered it well. And what I would just do as a description for those, for example, submissions, Danielle, is in the chat. I had a question about how can experts, researchers, right? What role can they play? So if you all go and look at the answer that I put in there, it actually has a link to the Global Stocktake page where the sources of inputs are and where submissions are listed. So that'll be a great illustration of what both Melissa and Danielle have been describing about this unique opportunity that the RINGO community has to contribute this way.
Perfect. Thanks, Tracy. And Ambassador, especially from your position as director of the Initiative on Sustainable Development Goals at the Tec de Monterrey, curious kind of your perspective on this question.
Well, first of all, I give you my excuses, but I am in the middle of a restaurant. I'm sorry. Well, you know, I have a previous conference and I had to stay here. So I'm sorry if you see that is, you know, here noises and music.
No worries.
This is because I am in a restaurant. Okay. Well, you know, Tec de Monterrey is a very, very committed institution to work for the SDG implementations and for climate neutrality. And this is a very, I would say, avant-garde institution, really committed to the SDGs and to fight climate change. So what we are doing is we have been advising the government throughout several channels. We have been working in the National Council for the Implementation of the SDGs. They know our positions, they know our papers, they know our presentations, they know what we think and what should be done. And this has been, you know, it's a permanent exercise. There are meetings every week in different aspects of sustainability in general and climate change in particular. Second, you know, we are neighbors, the US and Mexico. So we engage with several US universities to work on how the US and Mexico as countries, not as governments, as countries, may join forces to fight against climate change. So we produce a report at the beginning of this year with specific and you know, it's a long list, detailed list of recommendations, not only addressed not only to national governments, but national state governments, universities, private sector, to work together. Because Mexico and the United States, we can do many things except that, you know, we can divorce from each other. So we have to work, we share environments, common environments, and we have to work together. This report, I think, has been influential in government cycles as well as the private sector, because we made presentations with the private sector, so they know exactly what we are proposing. And I think our report was very well received. Besides, obviously, we are doing all the time this kind of conferences, webinars, you know, and virtual webinars, all you know, conferences with people participating as much as we can. We are trying, you know, to convey the same message that you have. This is a very existential issue. This is no longer, you know, a matter of endless diplomatic negotiations. We have to do something. This is our message, and I think we have been very successful. Thank you. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, thanks so much. So we have about 5 minutes remaining and lots of questions. So the plan is to do kind of rapid fire here. So I'm going to throw out some questions, direct them to the person they were sort of initially directed to. If anyone else wants to kind of expand, unmute yourself and jump in. And otherwise, we'll kind of try to fly through these so that we can get to as many as possible. So we had a couple questions, Danielle, related to your presentation. I want to get to some of those. So one was, you mentioned that you could kind of expand on why current funding mechanisms aren't necessarily enough when it comes to loss and damage. So maybe we'll give you a moment to speak on that. And specifically, we had a question come in. Is the Green Climate Fund one possible mechanism for funding loss and damage, or is that separate? And can you kind of explain that to us?
Yeah, definitely. I'll try to keep it brief on both. So for the second one first, just because it's more straightforward, yes, the Green Climate Fund is one of the options. We're creating a new funding stream under the Green Climate Fund for loss and damage is one of the options that have been put on the table, but it is one of, they're like, it's not at all like being most considered, or but it's something that's been mentioned, but it's not necessarily what is being negotiated right now. I'm sure it's also going to be coming up again at COP27. But developing countries are also asking for a separate and new loss and damage financing facility, not necessarily something under the GCF. On the kind of existing streams, and I saw in the Q&A somebody mentioned insurance specifically, so I'll speak to insurance briefly. So insurance for loss and damage is tricky because there's several different things that it does. So the way insurance works is ideally like people would be paying into a fund. So first, the issue in a lot of vulnerable countries is people don't have a lot of resources to be paying into the funds. So how an insurance mechanism would be funded is one question. And then if a disaster strikes an entire region or country, how do you deal with that for payouts? And then if disasters keep occurring repeatedly, that also goes against the core, how insurance is typically structured. So those are just three really quick issues with insurance. I mean, that's not to say that insurance isn't part of the solution. There are insurance mechanisms that are being developed. The Caribbean kind of has their own insurance mechanism that's regional. But as a standalone solution, it's insufficient. And then kind of similarly with like humanitarian funding streams, humanitarian aid funding streams, disaster risk reduction, those all have their own shortcomings already. There's already not enough resources being given to these, and they already have limited effectiveness. And neither of them are specifically for loss and damage and wouldn't be located under the UNFCCC as climate change finance. So they wouldn't necessarily be the best avenues for funding loss and damage. And that's very quick. Sorry to give really brief answers to those.
Anybody else want to jump in on that? Great. So another kind of loss and damage related question. If we could sum it up in a few brief sentences, what is the G77 and China's position as we understand it on loss and damage finance? And is there anything that civil society organizations can do to kind of be involved in what goes on with loss and damage finance during the negotiations? Ambassador, I can go to you first for some brief comments, and then Danielle, we can go to you next.
I think I can comment on that. I think something important may happen at COP27 on loss and damages. As long as, you know, those demanding assistance do not insist too much on a legal argument, on a legal basis. If those countries insist that, you know, you developed countries, you have a legal obligation to pay for my losses and damages, that would be very difficult. But on the other side, if countries, developed countries, really empathize with the situation of many, especially small island countries, which have included in the, it's not a small country, by the way, Pakistan and other countries that are really suffering tremendous damages because of climate change. If they empathize and they give a good signal that their concerns are going to be taken into account, you know, concretely with funds, with technical assistance, with something especially focused on them. As I said in my presentation, there is, you know, a limit to adaptation plans. How can you adapt when you 1/3 of your national territory becomes inundated? I mean, this is impossible to adapt to. So I think something with good diplomacy can be done, as long as the two parties will not take extreme positions. That's my view. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other panelists want to chime in on that one? We are at time, but I think probably everyone wants to hear the answers to our final questions here. So maybe we'll stick around for just a couple extra moments. Yeah,
I
Danielle.
can just really quickly on that one that I think finance period is the G77's main priority. Any kind of like right now there's no finance. And I think we're in a unique time where that might actually happen. And then the form it takes will be TBD, to be decided.
Great. So we have the perfect wrap-up question that's come in from a member of our audience on how can observers meaningfully contribute during COP27? So I'm going to give you the challenge of answering that each in one sentence, and hopefully each of you can give kind of a different answer building on each other. So Melissa, let's start with you and run through the order of speakers for this final question.
Sorry, can you just quickly repeat the question?
Yeah, so how can observers meaningfully contribute, or what's one way observers can meaningfully contribute during COP27?
Okay, well, firstly, of course, attend the Ringo meetings in the morning to get an update of what's happening at the COP. And of course, try not to spend too much time at the side events and pavilions. I know it's very tempting, very appealing normally to sit and listen to experts speak, but do spend also, balance your time at the negotiations, figuring out what's going on and participate in discussions with negotiators, with your peers, just so you get a sense of what's truly happening and the nuances in the positions of countries. I think that's the best way you can understand the negotiations is by participating in the negotiations. Observer badges usually can get in if the capacity allows. And I think most importantly is also what you do with that information when you get home. Try and share it with as many people as you can, make sense of it together in a group. And I think you can make a larger impact collectively in future COPs. Thanks.
Danielle.
I don't have that much to add. I agree with everything Melissa said. Definitely come to the Ringo's meeting as a non-steering committee member. It's been going for a very long time. I find them incredibly useful. It's the first thing I do every day. Yeah, I think just spreading also what you learn at the COP and what you encounter to other folks, I think is really important once you get back home, if you're there.
Tracy?
Hey, Anna, I was going to say next time, let's flip the order because Melissa and Danielle take all the good stuff. But I'll build on it. And I'd say, come prepared, meaning focus. It's such a huge meeting. So whatever your passion is, whatever your area of knowledge and expertise is, go to the provisional agendas, go to the annotations, focus on those issues and get up to speed on them. So that's one. And then go to those sessions, take notes, and building on what Melissa and Danielle said, bring that to the Ringo meetings. We ask people to update others. You'll meet kindred spirits. You'll have conversations. But then I'd say the final thing, and I just want to put a point on what Melissa said, when you take it home, because I think the question was, what can we do to have influence or an impact? Remember that under the nationally determined contributions, it takes your home countries, wherever you have political will or the capital to change things as an individual citizen, as an expert in your country. That's an opportunity to take your experience, what you took out of COP with all your preparation to influence what your country does to increase the ambition of their next NDC.
Thanks, Tracy. Ambassador, last word to you.
Keep focused on the 4 or 5 more important results of the conference and spread the message. All the time, if you tweet, please tweet that these are the key points. Feel that you represent someone else than beyond yourself. Feel that you are doing a contribution because you are. If you spread the message that this is so important to leave it in the hands of diplomats. So keep the pressure, insist on the importance of results. Believe me, the negotiators inside the rooms feel the pressure, so keep the pressure.
Thank you. Really helpful answers. None of them are one sentence, but that's okay. So with that, we'll just have a couple of final concluding words here. So thanks to everyone for joining us this evening. There was tons of information in these presentations. So if you want to go back, watch the webinar again, maybe download it, watch it on the plane to Egypt. you can do that. If you want to share it with your colleagues and friends, the recordings are going to be available on the Second Nature website within days. You can also find the first 2 webinars that Beth mentioned at the top there as well. As folks mentioned just in this final question, during COP, you can stay up to date with what's going on with Ringo, especially on the Ringo website. So that's ringosnet.wordpress.com for important updates, Ringo coordinating meeting times, and other opportunities to get together with fellow Ringos if you're in Egypt. Also lots of useful information there if you're not in Egypt. I also want to take a moment to plug that my organization, the Environmental and Energy Study Institute, produces a daily newsletter during COP open to the public, focused on what Congress, the US Congress, needs to know about COP27, but hopefully lots of useful information in there for everyone. So if you're curious about that, feel free to sign up at esi.org/sign-up. And we hope you found these webinars useful and helpful. Thank you so much to the panelists today and panelists throughout the 3 webinars, and many thanks again to Second Nature, University Climate Change Coalition, and the Ringo Constituency Group, and especially the team behind the scenes that made all of this happen. Mostly we just got to show up and other people did all of the planning. So thank you to those folks who made that all happen. Thanks to everyone for hanging on for a couple extra minutes, and hopefully we will see lots of you at COP, and have a great evening.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Anna.
Bye.
Bye.
Anna.